Music history is a humongous subject covering many centuries, people, developments in composition, and developments in instrument design. This video is a broad yet brief overview of music history from the Renaissance through the modern era. The Renaissance was a period of time of rebirth and reawakening of the mind and spirit in Europe from around 1400 to about 1600. The arts were very important during this time of deep thought, and music was considered to be particularly important. Three composers of the time were Lasso, Palestrina, and Hosler. These composers and others produced various types of music, including motets, madrigals, and masses. Motets are short, sacred, religious, unaccompanied choral works. Madrigals are short, usually secular, and also unaccompanied choral works. Masses are large religious compositions for choir and instruments made up of 5 parts: Kyrie, Gloria in Excelsis Deo, Credo, Sanctus and Benedictus, and Agnus Dei. Three common instruments of the time were the viol, the forefather of today's violin, viola, cello, and double bass; the lute; and harpsichord. The era following the Renaissance was the Baroque, and that was approximately 1600 to 1750. The word Baroque originally meant deformed or strange pearl, and was insulting. Music, art, and architecture that was labeled Baroque was considered to be too complicated and overly ornamented. This negative connotation has all but disappeared, and today the word Baroque refers to the highly complex music, art, and architecture created around 1600 to 1750. Several important and popular composers of that time were Antonio Vivaldi, Johann Sebastian Bach, and George Frederick Handel. Music that was composed during that time was often created to glorify God and be pleasing to the ear. Three important compositional forms of the era were the sonata, opera, and fugue. Baroque sonatas are large compositions of 3 to 6 parts, also known as movements, for 2 or more instruments. Operas are dramas performed by singers in costumes with instrumental accompaniment. A fugue is a composition made up of several melodic lines playing simultaneously, yet understandably. An important compositional tool of those days was figured bass, also known as basso continuo. In figured bass, the lowest part is written out, but the upper voices must be deciphered based on numbers or figures written with the bass. Organists and harpsichord players had to be able to read and interpret figured bass well and quickly. There were many instruments in use during the Baroque era, 3 of which are the Baroque traverse flute, the oboe, and the violin. The classical era follows the Baroque and was from about 1750 to 1830. Architects and artists of the time were greatly influenced by classical ancient Greek and Roman culture. Musically speaking, the classical era was a time of simplification and clarification. Music was still complex, but it was easier to understand the music from the Baroque era. Single melodies with basic harmonies to back them up gradually replaced counterpoint or several independent, different voices playing simultaneously. Perhaps the most famous name in classical music, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart, lived and worked during this time, as well as Franz Joseph Haydn and Ludwig van Beethoven. Many musical forms were composed during this epoch, including the symphony and various types of chamber music. Classical symphonies are large compositions for orchestras made up of 1 to 5 contrasting yet related movements, though 4 movements is most common. Chamber music is music composed for small groups of instrumentalists and/or vocalists, such as piano trios, string quartets, and quintets. Most of today's orchestral instruments existed by this time, though perhaps in a more primitive form. A new instrument, the pianoforte, was invented during this time and was a revolutionary development, as it could play at various volumes just by applying more or less pressure to the keys. No other keyboard instrument could do this at the time. The Romantic era was from about 1830 to 1900 and follows the Classical era. During this time, human experience and sentiment shaped music, art, and literature. Personal thoughts and feelings became the subjects, inspiration, and guiding motivation for many musicians, artists, writers, and philosophers in the Romantic era. 3 important composers of the day were Robert Schumann, Franz Liszt, and Johannes Brahms. Very popular types of compositions of those days were the song and program music. Songs are short pieces for either solo or accompanied voice, and program music is music that tells a story. Many instruments were further developed and improved during this epoch. The flute as we know it today was invented during this time, and 2 new instruments were invented: the tuba and the saxophone. After the Romantic era came the Modern era, which was the 20th century more or less. This was a time of great change and experimentation in music. Many long-held notions were fully abandoned as composers looked to mathematical equations, randomness, and even everyday sounds to create music. 3 composers from the modern era were Bela Bartok, Igor Stravinsky, and John Cage, the last of whom composed a piece of nothing but silence for 4 minutes 33 seconds. Serialism, tone clusters, and electronic music were some of the compositional developments made during the 20th century. Serialism is music based on a specific series of 12 notes. Tone clusters are dissonant, jarring chords made up of several notes that are played very close together. Electronic music is music produced with synthesizers and/or music produced using recorded sounds. There were, of course, many other important developments in people between motets and serialism, and Palestrina and John Cage, so stay tuned for more in-depth videos on music history.